Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to another deck tech. Now, this is a bit different to the other decks I've been doing because this is an actual control deck. Yes, I know. I've covered a lot of mid-range and aggro decks recently, but no, this is a proper control deck. Now, this is the return of the draw discard. Now, for those of you that haven't been around for a ridiculous amount of time, basically, one of the first decks I built in Spellweaver that did relatively well about a year ago at this point was a deck based around drawing as many cards as you could and then making your opponent discard and just winning through card advantage. Now that's what this deck was based around. It is quite similar to a lot of other decks that some other people have been playing, like Peacekeeper's been playing something like this, and Fuzz also has a deck like this which he called Casual Darius for the Drain. But this version is a little bit different. Like, I'm not running stuff like Flash Freeze, and I'm also running just random things like Splitting Headache. So, yeah, a little bit different, but the general theme is the same. So anyway, I also ran this in a tournament. I ran a worse version of this in a tournament, and I went 5-1, so the deck is fairly good. So, first things first, basic Darius. Yes, I know, Darius is still around. He's always been one of those heroes that kind of veers in and out of playability, but he works in this archetype. So, drawing cards is a very, very, very simple effect. I mean, it only has 3 words of text on it. However, you get to draw every other turn, and a lot of your stuff is quite powerful if you can draw into it in the late game. That's the point. That is the key phrase there. If you're in the late game, then Darius' ability is amazing because you just pay 3 mana and you get to draw into your high impact spells. He's not a good mid game hero because you don't have the mana to do it, and he can't be used early game. So you need to play your deck in such a way where you've got 2 things: high defense openings to slow the game down, and high impact cards to draw in the late game off the ability. And that's an interesting combination to actually get sort of together, and as a result, Darius has not been seeing that much play recently. That, and if you pair him with Dominion, which is the other aspect that works quite well with this sort of high impact late game, high defense early game with Wisdom, you're probably going to be playing one of the Dominion heroes, because Basic and Advanced Despina are both quite good control options. So yeah, chances are you won't be running Basic Darius. So yeah, this is the first deck played in a while that actually functions with Basic Darius properly. As I do not have music on. Much better. Anyway, so on to the early game defensive options. Quite a lot actually. We've got Noxious Fumes for the early removal. -2/-2 will kill a lot of stuff, and it's just 1 mana. Very, very efficient. Also got Consume, although Consume's more of a late game removal spell as opposed to an early game one, because you often want to hit it for 2 or 3 or 4 in some situations. So Consume is more of a late game option, but you can still use it to beat back some aggro decks, since you do have a few early game creatures. So yeah, very, very basic removal. I'm not running Flash Freeze. A lot of these decks do run Flash Freeze. I'm not sure if it's necessary. Like, I'm running a bit of a different style, which is a bit better against red in particular. Like, there isn't a lot of Flame Serpent running around right now, so Flash Freeze is not as amazing, and I'd rather just be running stuff like Force Mage. And I'm also running weird things like Splitting Headache for against combo and control decks. So that's why I'm not running the Flash Freeze 3rd removal option. Now, the early game creatures are interesting. You got Disquisitive Spirit. Now, this was Infected Survivor. However, I cut Infected for a Disquisitive. It turns out the flying is actually pretty insane with Consume in the deck. It's really, really nice. It also works quite well with Flash Freeze if you want to use Flash Freeze. It does work well with Disquisitive. I just didn't find the need for it because I think there's enough creature control in the deck already. But yeah, Disquisitive is actually quite an important part of this type of archetype. And on top of that, it's the only creature in the deck that dies to your own harpies, but you get to cycle when it dies, which is really, really good. And against control decks, you play your Disquisitives, you keep attacking, get maybe 2 to 4 damage in, they'll eventually have to kill them, and then you draw cards, so you draw into your burn spells. So it's actually quite a nice linchpin of the early game. Much, much better than Infected Survivor. That and the other openings you really want to do are New Horizons, and with Disquisitive Spirit means you don't have to, like, lock yourself into this weird, like, Corruption start Horizons next. It got really strange. So yeah, Disquisitive is a very, very nice addition to the early game. Now, the last sort of early defensive creature, not the last early drop, but the last early defensive creature is the Force Mage. Now, Force Mage is an absolute godlike card against red. It is not impossible to deal with efficiently. If they have a lizard and a goblin, they can actually trade the lizard for the Force Mage by attacking the lizard in first and then the goblin. But you still blocked 4 damage with this thing, so it's still really good. Now, remember, here comes the shield, Ron. Shield against red, or shield your stuff that's hard to remove. So against Corruption, shield your library guards. Against Dominion, shield the succubus. You get the idea. So basically, use the shield and stuff that is hard to remove. If they don't have removal spells, don't use the shield. And if you're against red, use the shield immediately. That's basically how Force Mage works. So that's the end of my little Force Mage section that appears in every single Wisdom deck tech. Now, that's just a basic early start kind of out of the way, but there's a second way of starting because it's a control deck. So you got the 4 New Horizons. This is actually more New Horizons than I ever play in other decks most of the time. New Horizons is a card that feels a bit dead once you play the second one a lot of the time. So in a lot of my control decks in the past, I've only played 3. However, in this one, there's an exception. Why? Because you're playing Corruption, and Corruption has Consume Spirit and Word of Pain that get massively fueled off New Horizons. I have often played sort of just 3 or 4 New Horizons in the game. I'm perfectly happy with it because it is an incredibly powerful card with those 2 spells. In general, New Horizons allows you to ramp into Library Guards and Harpy, which is really huge and will actually block most aggro decks. That's where your sort of extra defense comes. You get your New Horizons into your Harpy and your Library Guards. That, and if you're going second, you can spark out New Horizons. You're basically down, like, this is what basically happens. You're down a card, you're down the spark, and you skip turn 1. But you probably won't play anything on turn 1 anyway. And while you're down a card now, you would have gone up that shrine anyway, so you're actually not really down a card in the long run, which means all you've done is basically say, I'm going to go first, and I'm up a card, which is really strong. And unlike Power Surge, where if you Power Surge on turn 1, it doesn't do anything, New Horizons actually does. With Power Surge, you're just down a card, because you would have drawn a card off that mana anyway. So you're just down a card, down the spark, and you skip your first turn. So you're basically skipping your first turn to say, I'm going to go first now. Whereas the New Horizons, you're effectively going first, and you're up a card, which is really, really huge. And with that, you can ramp into stuff like Protector Spirit, or just Protector Library Guards or something, and that's still very, very good defense. So New Horizons is the linchpin of the early game and late game alike, because you'll be playing these in the late game to power up your spells. So New Horizons, very, very important spell. Now, with the New Horizons openings, you're really ramping into Library Guards and Harpy. Library Guards is hilariously the weaker of the 2 creatures. Library Guards is an incredible creature. 2/3, 3 speed, perfect stats for early defense, and it draws a card, which is just insane. And the only disadvantage of Library Guards is that if your opponent has an easy way of killing it, like you're against zombies, they have an infected survivor, they fumes it and attack it, and then they get more damage in, yes, you drew a card, but you're not actually stalling his aggressive plays, which means you're probably going to lose. So that's the only disadvantage of Library Guards, is that his ability is a value-based ability, but it will not actively stop the advance. Like, the more important part of this card is the 2/3 body with 3 speed. That's critical. Now, the late game, it is very, very good. It's sort of like a basic Darius hero power on a 2/3, which is just crazy value. So it's really, really, really good. But the reason it's not quite as good as Harpy is just because it doesn't stall the early game. Harpy is the true MVP and is the only reason this deck really works. Harpy is really powerful. It stops most aggro decks in their tracks. There's not much they can do to this thing. I mean, you have to use a Fireball, which is 3 mana, and they probably already lost a creature already, so they get massively sort of tempoed out by this, and also just they lose card advantage against Harpy. They gain a mana, which kind of sucks, but not really. I mean, it's the thing where there's only one Harpy target in this entire deck that actually does die to your own Harpies, which is the Squisitive Spirit. But then you get a bit of ramp and you draw a card, so it's actually fine. You're basically investing your 2 mana for some early defense, and then later on you'll sack it and you get your card back and you get half the mana invested back. So that's completely fine. But for your opponent, if they have sort of a Gibber and Ronnie down and then you play Harpy, they sack one of the tokens, and it's just like, well, they can't use the mana efficiently, so what do? Fireball it, and then they attack for 2. And that's a card and a half gone immediately, and they've also lost a massive amount of tempo, because they can't play much at 4 mana. So they can't play much at 4 mana, so they probably went up second level there, and they can't do much with that. And then they had 4 mana, 2 levels, and they fireball, so they basically skip their turn just to fireball this thing. So the mana they get from it is not always a massive drawback. So yeah, Harpy is absolutely amazing. It's also one of the ways you can fight stuff like Tombs of the Damned efficiently. So yeah, that's the real linchpin of the ramp openers, is that Harpy. Harpy is crazy, crazy powerful. Now, from there we get on to the mid-game plan. Now, the mid-game plan is to disrupt your opponent's hand while maintaining your own hand size. So this is embodied with the Mesmerizing Spirit, Splitting Headache core. Now, Mesmerizing Spirit is the much, much better of these two cards. Why? Because it is a 2/1 flying creature which works with Consume, and it always makes them discard, so it's always a 1/1 minimum. It's always a 1/1. It's a bit weak to stuff like Mutant, which means you can often hold on to Mesmerizing Spirit for a few turns. But when you draw multiple of these and you just keep playing them out, your opponent is in serious trouble. It also is incredibly good against stuff like zombies that love holding Succubus and Word of Pain for a few turns and Consume Spirit, and then you start discarding them. It's also one of the ways you can disrupt the Dragon deck quite efficiently, because sometimes they'll have a discard turn to maintain their hand size. They'll go down to 3 cards and you can go Spirit, Splitting Headache, and then they pretty much just lost. So Spirit is an incredibly good card and allows you to disrupt both control and aggro decks alike, which is just incredible. Now, the other half of the discard engine here is a card that I'm playing and not many other people do. Splitting Headache. Now, this is a 2-of. Splitting Headache is a very, very big tempo loss when you play it. It is 3 mana, which is not fantastic. However, it will let you fight control decks on their level, where they're doing all this crazy powerful stuff with Cataclysm and ramp spells, and they go absolutely crazy, and then you Splitting Headache them, and then they're down to 1 card. So yeah, Splitting Headache is incredibly powerful against control decks. It also lets you catch 1-turn heal unawares sometimes. They'll often play around stuff like Mesmerizing Spirit, and then you have Splitting Headache as well as the Mesmerizing, and they discard their entire hand, and sometimes that will lose them the game. It does happen. It's not massively common, but it does happen, and just the disruption in general allows you to fight on their level. And if they're not playing stuff like Vampirism and Lamp, you can usually just beat them because you have access to stuff like Succubus and Word of Pain, so you can just race them with massive amounts of levels in those abilities. It also lets you get a lot of extra card advantage over them, which is one of the ways you can actually fight level with control decks, other control decks, since this is more of a creature-based control deck as opposed to a spell-based control deck. Now, that's sort of the mid-game plan, is just controlling your opponent's hand while boosting the card advantage that you have. Why? Because this is where the late game comes in. This is the drain engine. This has showed up in almost every corruption deck I have ever built in the last couple of months, where it's just, you play your Word of Pain, you play your Succubus. I mean, even the Kainu deck was playing Succubus plus the bounce, and in hindsight, maybe even that should have played 4 Word of Pain. It's such a, or at least 3, it's such a powerful combination, because it lets you play 8 cards that deal 3 damage each, which is a massive amount of burn. So we'll start with Succubus, since it is the better of the 2 cards. So, Succubus, 3/3 with flying, that's really good, works with Consume. It's difficult to remove a 3/3, be kind of surprised. And it also drains. Now, note that's life loss, so if they have something like Unbreakable Spirit or Force Field, it bypasses it, which is actually quite important sometimes. But in general, Succubus is very, very good. It will get 3 or maybe even 6 damage in quite efficiently, and is just really hard to handle. And against a lot of non-control decks, you play your Succubus, you gain 3 life, you deal 3 life, and then they have to deal 3 damage to it. So you've effectively gained 6 life, which is actually really huge against a deck like Red, for instance. Now, against Corruption, if you can't control their board, sometimes you play Succubus, they consume it, and then attack, and then you're just a parody. You basically just traded a consume for a Succubus. Well, I mean, slight difference. I mean, they took 3 damage, but you haven't gained any life, and also you didn't play a creature. So tempo lost, but they took some damage. So it's not too bad, but it's not as good as it would be against something like Red, which is where the discard comes in. You discard their Succubi, and you discard their Word of Pains, and then you play your own. Now, Word of Pain is the more critical card against control decks in particular, because you can get up to 4 or 5 corruption levels with New Horizons and just power out the Word of Pains, dealing 4 or 5 damage each, and that is how you often race stuff like Lamp. It is possible. You can just play a bunch of your own creatures, consume them onto any creatures that can attack, dealing massive damage, and play Word of Pains, dealing 10, 15 damage in power turns. So this is definitely a way you can race the Lamp decks, and should not be underestimated. Word of Pain is an incredibly strong card. Also cantrips, which in this deck is less relevant because you're playing a lot of card draw already, like you've got 4 library guards and the basic Darius ability, and also Disquisitive Spirit, so it's not as critical as it is, say, in Mono Corruption, but it's still pretty big. Now, Word of Pain and Consume hit about as hard as they do in Mono Corruption. They usually hit for 2 or 3 in the mid game, and then they'll hit for 4 in the late game. So they average out at about 3 because of New Horizons, since once you play your first New Horizons, you're at 2 levels, and then you play the second one, you're actually above what you would have been able to do with just Mono Corruption at that point. So yeah, it is a card that will hit about as hard as it normally does in Mono Corruption, which is one of the reasons why Wisdom is a good pair for Corruption decks, since they can still use the really, really big spells to deal massive amounts of damage without getting hampered by the second aspect. Now, as for the shrine count, 18 shrines. I did try 19 for a while, but 18 seemed to be the correct number. You're playing a lot of draw, which means as long as you hit your first 4 or 5 shrine drops, you can usually just draw into the rest. As for the numbers, playing 9 Wisdom and then 9 Corruption, even split there, because you'll need to start Corruption or Wisdom sometimes, depending on how your opponent opens. You also need a lot of Corruption in the late game, but you kind of need the Wisdom openings a bit more, so you need to just split it down the middle. Now, 2 Sanctum, and then 7 basic Corruption, 9 basic Wisdom. The 2 Sanctum is an interesting number. I tried 3, and it just seemed like overkill, because you often draw through a lot of your deck, and you'll be divining probably every turn anyway to get your skill shrines, so it's often better to play 2, and you won't draw into Sanctum as many times. But Sanctum isn't even necessary in a lot of matchups, and in the longer games, which is when you actually need it, you'll get it, so it's definitely okay at 2. So anyway, let's see if we can find a ranked game. I have gotten to top 10 with this list before. I think it's a better tournament list than a ladder list, though. Like, for tournaments, you can tech it for the metagame. Like, tournament metagames are a lot more control-y. When I played this in tournament, I went 5-1, and I kind of made the joke that I should have been playing 4 Splitting Headache in that tournament because there was so many control decks. But yeah, it seems to work out. You can also tech stuff like Gnome to kill a lot of the artifacts at a 1-turn heal. Now, this hand is not that insane, but it's not exactly sketchy, so I'll keep it. Because I can divine twice. I'm not sure what he's playing. I'll get rid of a Disquisitive because I already have one. Now, I may get screwed on the second Wisdom Shrine, so I'll just go up a Corruption now, and then I'll New Horizons next turn. Now, Basic Darius could mean this is a mirror, but Basic Darius gives you probably the least information out of any hero. New Horizons, alright. This looks like it could be an energy deck. Could be one turn heal. I wouldn't be shocked. Now, we do not need the second harpy. I'm going to divine before New Horizons just to increase my chances of hitting the divine by a very, very small margin, but it does exist. Now, I'm not sure what his deck is yet, so I'm not going to start getting rid of the Sanctums yet. If it was Advanced Darius, I would have got rid of a Sanctum there. Oh, second spirit. Third spirit. I think we're just going to divine one of the spirits and play a harpy just to get some damage going. And then next turn I can New Horizons again and play a spirit. Interesting. Now I could use Noxious Fumes here just to clear. Because I drew the LG, I actually think that's correct. Fumes this, pass the turn, then I don't have to attack. Okay. Still not really sure what he's playing. This could just be some sort of Order Wisdom mid-rangey deck. It's difficult to tell just from what he's played so far. Relic Guard's a bit interesting. The rest has been fairly standard just for any sort of control deck. Second Horizons. Okay, so he passed turn, so I can get a bit of damage in here. The second LG is nice, because I can actually play the LG and then play a New Horizons. There's one Sanctum, so I'm actually just going to New Horizons for the second Sanctum here. Get 4 damage in. I'm trying to power up my Word of Pains quite a bit here because any sort of control deck is going to boil down to just Word of Pains and Succubi. Oh no, that's interesting. That's very interesting. I'll draw the Shrine. Succubus. These will both detonate next turn, probably. Like, he probably has some method of dealing with it. I do want to get these Disquisitives out of hand, but we'll just attack first, see what he plays. Like, Pacify or something. Disarm. Okay. So he gets a bit of damage in. I think it may just be better to pass on the hero power and just cycle out these spirits. Yeah, because then I can play a Force Mage and I can shield up immediately. The reason I'm shielding up immediately is simply because if he just plays an artifact and passes, I actually don't get a chance to shield. I'm going to hold on to this for now. Yeah, any artifact detonates both of them. Astral Dive, that's not what I was expecting. I mean, that does it as well, and yeah, here it goes, detonates. So I keep one of my library guards, and I draw 2 cards. Splitting Headache. Another LG. A Consume. Now, normally Splitting Headache would be very, very good here. But in this case, I'm going to Divine Offering it because he has so many cards in hand that it's good earlier on where I can disrupt, but here he just has so many cards in hand, even something like Mesmerizing Spirit wouldn't be very good. Now, I'm just going to play the Succubus because I need to start pressuring. He just played a big board wipe combination, so I can pressure the board a little bit through this method. Since this, even through disarm, I still get a little bit of damage in. Okay, I can consume that. Interesting. I think I've got lethal though, don't I? Yeah, consume Word of Pain. Yep, there you go. The consume Word of Pain is 8 damage there. Even if he hadn't played something, I could have played like a Disquisitive and drained onto my own creature. But yeah, he had a very, very defensive deck, but while he was up on card advantage, I could still just apply pressure through my own creatures and just eventually get to a burn strategy there. I think that Word of Pain would have eventually gone up to probably about 5 before I started playing it, and his deck doesn't, like, that color combo has no way of disrupting Word of Pain realistically. Like, you could have Spell Warden, I guess, but then my removal becomes live. So, yeah, unless he started doing some weird Word of Grace stuff, I think that was just a matchup that you can't really compete with. This kind of deck in general is interesting in terms of matchups. I think that's what I'll talk a little bit about before I close out this video. It sort of plays disruption techs for every matchup. It is not perfect though. I don't think this is like the best deck in the game right now. I think it's a pretty good deck, and it's something which, depending on what you're expecting, like, it's a good tournament list because it's very consistent, and depending on what you're expecting, you can tech the deck out. So, like, if you're expecting a bunch of control decks, like, there's a lot of control decks in tournaments right now. You can actually tech the deck and you can say, maybe cut on some harpies or something, and then you can just play, quite literally, 4 splitting headaches and 2 gnomes, and you will rip apart a one-turn heal deck. Like, 4 splitting headaches is not something they can really deal with. So stuff like that you can just tech into for tournaments. For ladder, you kind of have to stick to something like this. The other versions often play stuff like Flash Freeze, so if you cut the 2 splitting headaches, and then I think if I was running Flash Freeze, I'd probably cut 2 splitting headaches, and then probably maybe 1 Word of Pain, and then run 3. It's difficult. I think you could definitely fit in the 2 quite easily. You just take out the headaches for Flash Freeze, because that's, you're just teching, instead of against control decks, you're teching against aggro decks. But outside of that, it's difficult, because the rest of the cards all kind of fit both roles. So I'm not really sure you can argue to sort of change some other stuff. It definitely depends on per player. I'd have to look at some of the other versions to see what they're running instead. But yeah, the rest of the deck seems pretty solid. It's just a few different tech options you can have a look at. But anyway, as far as mono order seems okay because you're playing harpy. Mono rage is reasonable. It's about 50-50. You do have some issues dealing with Phoenix in particular. That's a problem. Phoenix is an issue. However, the rest of the deck seems okay. Like, Dragon is not unkillable. 2 removal spells will do it. I've actually consumed a Dragon for 5 before and got a steal win through that, so that does work. You're also playing Word of Pain and Succubus, which gains you a lot of life, so you can work against the Dragon deck a little bit better than you'd expect. Wisdom Dominion is a little rough in my experience. You need to apply pressure early and maintain it. Well, I say early, turn 5 really, and just maintain it from there. You have to keep attacking and playing succubi and things like that, because otherwise if it gets lamp set up, you're in a bit of trouble. Like, I did play against some Wisdom Dominion decks in tournaments in particular, because it's quite popular there, and it was rough. Like, I didn't lose to it continuously, but it was rough, and it's something where I would actually tech in gnomes if I am playing a tournament now, I think, with this list, because it is something you're going to play against a lot in tournaments, so I wouldn't put it past a lot of people to be playing Wisdom Dominion control decks in tournaments in particular. 1 turn heal, something similar. You got discard and maybe, I guess, tech in gnomes if you're seeing a lot of that stuff. Zombies seems fairly okay. Most of the top tier decks are at 50-50 with this, which in itself makes the deck pretty good. But it does require a lot of practice to get the deck correct. And also, you're going to have to edit it a little bit depending on what you're expecting to face or what you're even having issues with. So keep note of that if you want to try this kind of deck out yourself. But anyway, thank you for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, want to ask me any questions about the deck, put it in the comment section below. But as now, it's been Jotto, signing off.